Hey, this is Joe from Home Studio Corner. Today we're going to talk about common vocal compression mistakes. But before we do, if you don't already have a copy of my 5-step mix guide, what are you waiting for? Go to 5stepmix.com and get your free copy today. The first mistake I want to talk about will probably surprise you. It's not that people use too much compression on their vocals. It's actually the opposite. People don't compress their vocals enough. I was just doing a critique for somebody a couple of days ago, and one of the pieces of feedback I gave him was, hey, this vocal could use some more compression. It's kind of all over the place. It's here, but then certain words jump out and are too loud, and then certain words are too quiet. And instead of giving like a solution like go and automate every phrase, that I suppose you could do that. Compression is a much simpler way to do that. And it turns out the person wrote me back and said, hey, you said I needed more compression on my vocal. I went into my mix, opened up the compressor, and realized it wasn't doing anything. I thought it was, but I had like the threshold set so high that the compressor never really triggered. So the vocal wasn't being compressed at all. So that tells us we need to have some compression there. So the one thing I want you to know about this is don't be afraid to be a little aggressive with compression on vocals. They tend to like it okay. There's some things you want to keep in mind. We'll talk about those in a second. But a fair amount of compression happening on the vocal can usually be a good thing. One way to make sure that happens is to make sure you go fairly fast with your attack and release times so that the compressor is clamping onto that vocal pretty quickly. That'll help make sure that you've got some compression happening. Here's an example of what that would sound like. Okay, here is a raw lead vocal on a chorus of one of my EPs.
Wise men say they'll never understood.
Okay, so it's a pretty wide dynamic range. I think it will take to compression nicely. So let me just throw a compressor on here. This is the stock compressor in Studio One. Let's zoom in and let's talk about it. First thing, I'll probably make the attack and release about like 10, 20 milliseconds or so. If you go super slow on the attack, a lot of the initial sound gets through and it makes the vocal sound funky sometimes. Like the Fs come through like, and it's just like this thumpy sort of a sound. So I tend to go fairly quick here. Ratio, it doesn't really matter. I go like somewhere 3 or 4, and I'm just going to pull this thing down until I get a decent amount of bouncy bounce on the gain reduction meter, so a decent amount of compression. And then I'll use the makeup gain to make up for the loss in volume that we've experienced, and then we'll see how it sounds. Here we go.
Wise men say, wise men say, they'll never understood. Wise men say.
There's like this, if you can't hear compression, which is completely normal. When I first started, compression was the biggest mystery of all time, and it was hard to hear, and it takes a lot of time. But here's what to listen for. Like when I listen to this as the vocalist, it feels like someone is squeezing my throat. That sounds weird. When it gets to the loud part, I'm expecting it to come out louder. Oh, why? I'm expecting that whys to be real loud and kind of hurt my ear, so I like tense up and get ready for it. But then somebody steps in and says, "Meh, meh, turn yourself down, you're too loud." And so that there's like a ceiling, a lot like a limiter, there's a ceiling there that the vocal can't cross. So now I can push up the vocal into that ceiling, so to speak, and it allows the vocal to have the appearance of getting louder because I'm singing louder, but the actual volume is kind of limited. So instead of jumping out like this,
wise men say,
you can hear how just those phrases there over the top of the entire mix are probably going to get lost. The loud part comes through and we hear that, then the quieter part goes away. But with compression, it all has a little more of an even volume.
Wise men say.
You hear how it sounds like somebody's riding the fader on that, taking the quieter part, like this section here, and moving the volume up. It's not. Compression does all that work for us and makes it a lot easier. So that's just a quick where I would go with compression if I was setting it up on a vocal. The second big vocal compression mistake is not really a compression mistake as much as it is an EQ mistake. Here's what I mean. Folks will put EQ before the compressor, and they'll use the EQ to roll off all the low mids and low end in an honorable attempt to keep the vocal from being muddy. Problem is, now that all those lows are gone, the end result, once you add compression, is a pretty harsh sounding vocal. I found that the compressor on a vocal loves to hear all that low end. Something about the way those low frequencies trigger the compressor, it keeps it sounding kind of aggressive and beefy and good to my ears. So the simple solution is to, we want the vocal to not be muddy, but save that EQ for after the compressor. So the compressor can do all its juicy goodness, then we can take care of removing that excessive low end. Let me show you what that sounds like. Okay, we're gonna stick with the compressor that we had before. I'm gonna turn it off for a second, and here before the compressor, you can see it's before in the chain, we're gonna add some EQ. So I've turned the compressor off for a second. Let's just adjust this EQ, make the vocal sound nice and thin, like it'll sit in the mix well.
Wise men say, though never understood.
That's a pretty nice, thin sounding vocal, which is fine. It's probably close to where it needs to be in the final mix. But listen to what the compressor sounds like now that we've done that.
Wise men say.
And especially if we go pull the threshold down, because it's a lot quieter now that we've removed a lot of those low frequencies. So if we go back and try to get that same amount of compression we had before, where it was around 12 or so dB of gain reduction, here's what that sounds like.
Wise men say, though never understood.
It's not bad, but it just has this overall thinness to it. Listen again.
Wise men say.
And it feels like the sibilants, the S's and all that is it's extra exaggerated. Versus if we just put that EQ after, let's see what that sounds like. And let me bring the threshold back to where it was for a fair comparison.
Wise men say, though never understood.
To me, that sounds better. You might say, Joe, you were out of your gourd. But I find, that this, without the EQ, sounds better.
Wise men say.
I like the way all that woo triggers the compressor, and then I can EQ accordingly. Maybe not quite so aggressive, but EQing that sound gives me just plenty of warmth to let just the right amount in and end up with a nice, upfront, in-your-face, aggressive, cool, beefy vocal.
Wise men say.
Now, the final mistake people will make is maybe they follow my advice of doing a nice, aggressive amount of compression on the vocal, but one of the byproducts of that aggressive compression, you've already heard it here, is sibilance. Sibilance is the sound of those consonants like S's and T's that when you listen to my voice normally, that's not super exaggerated, but once you compress it, those S's become like daggers that chop your ears off. And that doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't compress. We actually have a solution for that. As you probably know, it's called a de-esser. And a lot of folks they either just forget about it. They're so caught up in everything else, they forget to listen for that and to add a de-esser, or they're too wimpy with their de-esser. So don't be wimpy with the de-esser. Here's what that looks like in Studio One. We have a de-esser plugin. And you can use like multi-band compression for this. There's lots of different ways. Dynamic EQ can work for this. But the idea is to kind of choose the frequency where the sibilance happens, which is, to me, probably 6 to 8K, somewhere in there, and then adjust it down. The problem is people will usually do it something like this.
Wise men say.
They'll do it until they see some gain reduction happening on that word say. And they're like, okay, cool, we have it. Problem is, I don't think, if you close your eyes and listen to that, not looking visually at the gain reduction, but just listen, I would say that S is still a little too loud.
Wise men say.
I mean, it's significantly louder than the rest. If that's the case, we need to pull it on down. One trick you can do is just pull it down until it almost sounds like the singer has a lisp, where like there's no S sound at all, and then work your way back up. It's an easier way to do it. The problem is you'll see there's going to be a crap load of gain reduction, and you're going to think, your brain's going to tell you that's wrong. Let your ears make this decision. This is one spot where it's only compressing those high frequencies, so it's not going to make the vocal sound over compressed. But pull it down to here where it sounds terrible.
Wise men say.
And then let it back up until there's just the right amount of brightness on that S. I'm going to loop that for the sake of annoying all of us. So kind of right in there feels good. A little bit lower and you can hear the de-esser working. The vocal sounds like it's going, like it's being sucked back, which it literally is. So that's a little too much still. But then coming up and there's a spot where it gets bright again. That's typically kind of the spot where I try to stick it. So up at like -18 was too much, so I pulled it back down. -24 seems to be right. And if we listen to the whole vocal line,
Wise men say.
Now that S, if you'll notice back before the de-esser, you probably cringed every time that S came in. Your ears did that thing where they go, you know, they tighten up like back behind your ear and like literally make your ears turn into kind of a limiter where it doesn't hurt your ears as much. We don't have to do that anymore. That's a great indication, by the way. If you feel yourself tensing up on certain phrases or certain sounds, probably something that needs to be dealt with. Now that we have the de-esser, that tension for me doesn't happen anymore.
Wise men say.
Okay, those are some vocal compression mistakes to avoid. Hope this was helpful, gave you some ideas, and got you excited about mixing. This only makes sense within a framework of an entire mixing process, which is my 5-step process, which you can check out for free. Just go to 5stepmix.com to get your free copy of the 5-step mix guide. Thanks for watching. See ya.